Hello, and welcome to another episode of Child Abuse Awareness with Darlene J. Clark. Be a part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Hello, how is everyone doing tonight? I hope you're doing great. It's been a beautiful day today. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is the use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use gets a balance in favor of fair use. I normally say that, just be on the safe side. Okay, so we go read a couple Bible verses. Make sure that in Isaiah 117 it says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, pick up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Am I talking loud enough? I don't want to blast too loud. I notice that sometimes my voice really gets a little bit too loud in here. We need to remember in Matthew 18, verse 10, take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. Without further ado, I'm going to run two different things at the bottom of the screen. Helplines, Talk for Healing, Indigenous Ontario Hotline is going across the bottom of the screen at the moment. They also do virtual sessions available. To book a session now, it's got the information at the bottom of the screen, and I think I also have it in the about on the YouTube channel. Here's one. The Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking operates Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, confidential, multilingual service available 24/7. If you suspect that you or someone you know may be being exploited, if you want to access support, or if you want to learn more, it's got the phone number at the bottom, 1-833-900-1010, or to reach out by a chat at www.canadianhumantraffickinghotline.ca. So I would interchange them off and on. Please come and say a friendly hello. Thank you so much for being here, Chris, and everyone that's here. Share the screen. Need to make it into a fuller screen where you can see it better. Can you see that okay? So first, I want to share with a Canadian. This is 2024 Trafficking in Persons Report. Figure we'll start at this. Canada, Tier 1. The Government of Canada fully meets the minimum requirement standards for the elimination of trafficking. The government continued to demonstrate serious and sustained efforts during the reporting period. Therefore, Canada remained on Tier 1. These efforts included identifying more trafficking victims, including victims of forced labor, enacting legislation to require forced labor reporting in Canadian supply chains, and expanding prevention measures tailored for at-risk and underserved populations in Canada. Although the government meets the minimum standards, it did not maintain comprehensive data on anti-trafficking law enforcement efforts and services provided to victims with government funding nationwide. The government's efforts to provide protections to all victims particularly forced labor victims, and investigate and prosecute forced labor crimes, remained inadequate. The range, quality, and timely delivery of trafficking-specific services varied nationwide, and service providers reported a shortage of victim services, including emergency shelters and longer-term housing. The government had not yet created a survivor-led advisory committee as recommended by its national strategy. Prioritized recommendations. Vigorously investigate and prosecute trafficking crimes, including forced labor and extraterritorial commercial child sexual exploitation and abuse, and seek adequate penalties for convicted traffickers, which should involve significant prison terms. Increase trauma informed specialized services and provide shelter to all victims, including male victims, foreign national victims, and members of marginalized communities throughout the country, in partnership with civil society. Increase training for criminal justice officials, emphasizing the importance of ordered restitution to survivors upon trafficking convictions. Amend the Criminal Code and Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to include definitions of trafficking that are consistent with the international law definition. Enact a policy to ensure victims are not inappropriately penalized solely for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of being trafficked. Establish a survivor-led advocacy council within the national strategy governing framework to assist in policy development and ensure members are duly compensated for their work. Increase information sharing, cooperation with, and resources for First Nations, Metis, and Inuit, indigenous communities, and NGOs to address the disproportionate impact of trafficking on those communities. Improve nationwide trafficking data collection, including timely consolidation of data on investigations, prosecutions, and convictions disaggregated by type of exploitation, numbers of identified victims, and assistance provided. Strengthen laws and policies and their enforcement to prevent the importation of goods made with forced labor. Prosecution. The government maintained law enforcement efforts. Federal Crime Code sections 279.01 and 279.011 criminalize sex trafficking and labor trafficking, prescribing penalties of 4 to 14 years imprisonment for trafficking adults and 5 to 14 years imprisonment for trafficking children. That needs to be a lot longer than that, y'all. I'm sorry. These penalties were sufficiently stringent and with respect to sex trafficking, commensurate with those for other grave crimes such as rape, consistent with the definition of trafficking under international law. The law did not establish the use of force, fraud, or coercion as an essential element of the crime. Section 279.02 also criminalized receiving financial or any other material benefit from trafficking and prescribed a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment for offenses involving adult victims and a mandatory minimum of 2 years to a maximum of 14 years imprisonment for offenses involving child victims. Section 27903 criminalized withholding or destroying documents to facilitate trafficking and prescribed a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment in cases involving adult victims and a mandatory minimum of 1 year to a maximum of 10 years imprisonment in cases involving child victims. Really? Wow. Section 286.1 criminalized purchasing commercial sex acts from an individual younger than 18 years of age and prescribed a minimum penalty of 6 months. Whoa. And a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment. Wow. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, IRPA, established a separate crime of human smuggling and trafficking to mean no person shall knowingly organize the coming into Canada of one or more persons by means of abduction, fraud, deception, or use or threat or force or coercion. Inconsistent with the definition of trafficking under international law, this provision did not include exploitation as an essential element of the crime. Wow. Government officials at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels investigated and prosecuted trafficking crimes, including criminal code offenses committed in their respective jurisdictions. But the federal government did not report comprehensive law enforcement data at each of these levels. Government officials prosecuted suspects charged under the IRPA. The federal government did not maintain a national database. Wow. Why not? The Uniform Crime Reporting UCR system included provincial and municipal police data, but did not disaggregate between sex and labor trafficking. UCR data was available in July 2023 for the 2022 calendar year, but the government did not report complete investigation data from police forces nationwide for the current reporting period. Additionally, the Integrated Criminal Court Survey, ICCS, administered by Statistics Canada, collected provincial and territorial prosecution data, but did not include Superior Court data from Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, municipal court data from Quebec, or data on charges that are considered trafficking offenses under the international law definition, such as Section 286.1 of the Criminal Code. The government provided ICSS prosecution data from April the 1st, 2021 to March the 31st, 2023, but did not report complete prosecution data from courts nationwide for the current reporting period. In 2023, for UCR data, police estimated investigating 512 incidents of trafficking offenses. In 2022, police reported investigating 528 incidents that led to charging 212 individuals with human trafficking crimes the same year. The government provided updated figures for 2021, with police investigating 555 incidences and charging 269 individuals. Federal officials for the Canadian Border Services Agency and Royal Canadian Mounted Police opened investigations into 133 new cases between April the 1st, 2023 and March the 31st, 2024, compared with 72 reported cases from April to November 2022. Both agencies reported 25 ongoing cases from the previous reporting period. Between April and December 2023, Employment and Social Development Canada identified 168 suspected forced labor cases within the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, an increase from 150 suspected cases referred between April and November 2022. Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, which conducted administrative investigations of potential human trafficking cases among immigration and refugee cases, conducted 21 new large-scale investigations involving allegations of human trafficking in 2023, noting no change from 2022. The government reported partial data on prosecutions and convictions for at least the second consecutive year. Between April the 1st, 2023 and September 30th, 2023, authorities estimated prosecuting 129 cases and convicting 24 traffickers. 6 prosecutions were ongoing from the prior reporting period. For comparison, between April the 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022, federal, provincial, and municipal authorities prosecuted at least 184 alleged trafficking cases and reached guilty verdicts for at least 37 cases. The government did not report sentencing data for convicted traffickers. The government reported courts may have acquitted some defendants of trafficking charges, but convicted them under the other sections of the criminal code. The government reported authorities prosecuted the majority of trafficking cases at the provincial level, although it did not provide complete data on provincial level prosecutions and convictions. Some provinces and municipalities included Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Calgary, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver maintain specialized anti-trafficking law enforcement units and prosecutors. Some provincial law enforcement collaboration existed along the Montreal, Toronto, Windsor corridor or along northern Ontario and Quebec, where traffickers often transfer victims. You see that right there? Let's read that again. Some provincial law enforcement collaboration exists along the Montreal, Toronto, Windsor corridor or along northern Ontario and Quebec, where traffickers often transfer victims. However, NGOs noted a continued imbalance in the government's anti-trafficking efforts, with limited attention to and understanding of forced labor. Data collection, information sharing, and coordination challenges among federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal authorities continue to limit anti-trafficking law enforcement effectiveness. The Canadian Police College provided a human trafficking investigators course that trained police on understanding the scope of trafficking crimes, fostering trust between law enforcement and victims, and overcoming challenges in investigating and prosecuting trafficking cases. The RCMP provided an online introduction to a human trafficking course completed by law enforcement officials and is in the process of replacing it with a new survivor-led online course on human trafficking detection for frontline workers and all Canadian law enforcement personnel. That's pretty good though, because a survivor-led online course. The RCMP's operational manual provided guidelines and procedures for investigating human trafficking cases. The CBSA provided an online training course on human trafficking to new recruits. The Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada regularly made presentations during the human trafficking investigative courses at the provincial and federal levels to educate law enforcement officials on using financial intelligence in human trafficking investigations. Police cooperated with foreign law enforcement officials on several open investigations. For example, RCMP and the National Child Exploitation Center collaborated with the Philippine National Police on investigations against extraterritorial child sexual exploitation and abuse. The government did not report any investigations, prosecutions, or convictions of government employees complicit in trafficking crimes. You might be making a mistake there. In May 2022, an RCMP officer was charged with trafficking for allegedly recruiting a victim from Mexico under false pretenses and subsequently exploited in domestic servitude in Canada. The case was undergoing trial in 2024. Protection. The government, you're just sitting there listening. Okay, that's okay. Thank you, Eric. The government increased protection efforts. The government did not report data on the number of victims identified by provincial and municipal police in 2023. Federal government officials identified 84 victims of unspecified forms of trafficking in 2023, compared with 58 victims in 2022. Identified victims included 59 women, 5 men, and 20 girls. The government provided UCR data for 2022 showing federal, provincial, and municipal police identified a total of 439 victims compared with 418 victims identified in 2021. Government-funded NGOs identified an estimated 1,545 trafficking victims, 1,135 for sex trafficking, and 410 for unspecified forms of trafficking in 2023. In January 2024, the government updated its handbook for criminal justice practitioners and frontline officials, including police, justice practitioners, and border officials, to enable them to proactively screen for trafficking indicators and appropriately assist potential victims through best practices and trauma-informed response. RCMP officers followed a procedure to refer trafficking victims to services, while referral procedure for other frontline institutions varied by jurisdiction. Public Safety Canada's National Office of Victims served as a resource to victims of any type of crime, including by providing information over email and maintaining an online directory of services. Provinces and territories were primarily responsible for the delivery of victim services, with the federal government providing funding to service providers. The government did not report complete data on victims receiving government-funded services. The federal government allocated 1,900,972 Canadian dollars to Justice Canada's Victims Fund to support trafficking victims and groups at high risk of exploitation, a significant increase compared with 1.16 million Canadian dollars. That's what it is right there. That's how much money right there. In 2022. Through this fund, the government provided funding to organizations implementing 16 projects to improve services for trafficking victims and develop and deliver training for law enforcement officers and service providers in the provinces and territories. Projects varied in duration and in range of objectives and types of victims served. Some projects aimed to improve victim identification. Others serve women and girls at high risk of trafficking. As a result, data may be incomplete, not comparable, or unsynchronized with reported cycles, hampering the government's ability to analyze trends and strengthen protection efforts. Implementing organizations reported provided services to approximately 1,135 victims and vulnerable individuals through government-funded projects between January and November 2023, compared with approximately 894 victims and vulnerable individuals assisted during the same period in 2022. Under the national strategy, the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality Canada continued implementing a nearly 14 million Canadian dollars initiative funding 42 projects working to prevent and address trafficking and support victims and at-risk underserved populations. Service provision models varied across the country depending on provincial demographics, priorities, and budgets. In some provinces, victims access government services through police or the courts, while other provinces offered victims more comprehensive individual support. Victims could typically access emergency housing, medical services, psychological care, safety planning, and court preparation and accompaniment. Some jurisdictions offered additional legal services to victims of sexual offenses, including sex trafficking. In many provinces and territories, provided counseling services beyond the duration of a trial. Assistance was available for Canadian and foreign victims, as well as male and female victims. The service providers reported they primarily served Canadian women and girls. Several provincial governments funded or implemented trafficking-specific programming. The government of Alberta continued funding ACT Alberta, a multi-sectoral coalition of NGOs, government bodies, faith-based groups, and survivors to provide services to victims and coordinate a provincial response to trafficking. Alberta also continued implementing its 22.8 million Canadian dollar action plan to combat trafficking. The plan continued funding for specialized victim support coordinators embedded within law enforcement teams to facilitate community and law enforcement collaboration. These roles reportedly played a critical role in improving victims' safety and well-being from initial identification throughout the entirety of an investigation. Alberta's government also established the Alberta Office to Combat Trafficking in Persons with 3 NGO partners in July 2023 to improve victim services coordination. Alberta also trained staff in the provincial office assistant temporary foreign workers to recognize labor trafficking indicators and refer potential victims to services. The government of Ontario continued implementing its 5-year, 307 million Canadian dollars strategy to combat trafficking that included clinical, therapeutic, and cultural responsive services to child sex trafficking victims, including indigenous. I said it right a while ago, but I'm having trouble now, right? Children, survivor-led programming and services for sex trafficking victims and vulnerable communities, free legal services for trafficking survivors of all ages. Ontario also funded 3 pilot programs that paired child protection workers with police officers to collaborate on the front lines of victim identification, assistance, and referral and investigations. The government of Quebec continued implementing its 2021 to 2026 action plan against sexual exploitation, including sex trafficking, allocating 150 million Canadian dollars to 37 measures over 5 years. In Manitoba, police and NGOs continue to assist victims through a collaborative response team and to implement prevention strategies. For example, PSC funded a Manitoban NGO through the Contribution Program to combat serious and organized crime to provide counseling, housing, and pre-employment training services to at-risk Indigenous females, including trafficking victims. The government of British Columbia continued a grant program using civil forfeiture proceeds to support community-led projects on crime prevention and victim assistance, including organizations working on trafficking. The government of BC amended its Crime Victims Assistance Act in December 2023 to expand support and services to victims, including trafficking victims, immediate family members, and witnesses. In 2022-2023, the Crime Victims Assistance Program received more than 4,700 applications from victims, immediate family members, and witnesses, and distributed nearly 17 million Canadian dollars in benefits. In November 2023, Saskatchewan, passed legislation relieving victims and survivors of negative credit factors incurred during their victimization. Lenders were prohibited from penalizing victims for coerced debts when evaluating loan applications. In December 2023, after successful completion of a one-year pilot program, the provincial government announced 1.2 million Canadian dollars in additional funding over the next 4 years for an NGO to continue providing shelter and support services for women and youth survivors of sex trafficking. Prince Edward Island Victim Services provided court preparation and psychological services for trafficking victims, and its provincial Human Trafficking Committee created a website to consolidate available resources for victims. NGOs operated shelters nationwide for victims of violence, mostly women and their accompanying children. The government funded some shelters, but only a few provided accommodations specifically for trafficking victims. Service providers reported that there was insufficient supply of emergency shelters, medium to long-term housing, and specialized medical and psychological services to meet the needs of trafficking victims. They also reported some available shelter options were not adequate for victims to receive appropriate trauma-informed care. As part of the national strategy, PSC initiated a process to develop guidelines on providing trauma-informed care to sex and labor trafficking victims. Canadians who were victims of trafficking crimes that occurred outside Canada were eligible to receive financial assistance for travel, psychological services, and other expenses through the Victims Fund, as well as assistance from Canadian consular officials abroad, although the government did not report providing this assistance to any victims. Wow. Global Affairs Canada officials had procedures to proactively identify potential trafficking victims working in diplomatic households in Canada, including through verifying payroll records and conducting random and systematic interviews with domestic workers in diplomatic households, and did not report identifying any victims during the year. What are y'all doing with the money? Because there's got to be victims. Come on now. The government provided alternatives to removal for foreign trafficking victims who face retribution or hardship in their home countries. In their home countries? Immigration officials could issue foreign trafficking victims and their dependents a temporary resident permit, allowing them to remain in Canada under regularized immigration status, receive access to health care, including psychological services, and in some cases apply for a work permit. Officials issued short-term TRPs for up to 180 days or long-term TRPs for 3 years. Authorities did not require victims to participate in an investigative or prosecution to be eligible for a TRP. And victims could apply directly without a referral from law enforcement or service providers, and immigration authorities reviewed trafficking-related TRP applications on a priority basis. Between January and October 2023, the government issued 98 TRPs to foreign trafficking victims and their dependents. By comparison, the government issued 138 TRPs to foreign trafficking victims and their dependents between January and October 2022. During the same period in 2023, the government issued 96 work permits to foreign trafficking victims and their dependents, a significant decrease from 263 such permits issued in 2022. Foreign victims were from Mexico, Guatemala, Philippines, Republic of Korea, the Bahamas, United States, Barbados, and Bangladesh. Hello there so much. Hi, Leo. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Canadian federal law provided victims and other witnesses participating in trials various protections, many of which were mandatory for children or people with disabilities at a judge's discretion. At a judge's discretion. Wow. These protections included video testimony, the presence of a support person during testimony, a ban on publishing names or of releasing identifying information about witnesses, and the closing of courtrooms to the public. Yes, you got to keep their safety the utmost importance. The victims. Authorities did not report how frequently courts afforded these protections to trafficking victims during trials. The Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights guaranteed access to a complaint mechanism for victims whose rights may have been denied by a federal institution. Through the Victims Fund, government funded organizations providing training on trauma informed practices for criminal justice officials and other victim service providers. NGOs reported the lack of victim centered methods re traumatized some victims during court proceedings. Courts could order traffickers to pay restitution to victims under Canadian criminal law, and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario had laws allowing trafficking victims to seek civil redress. Some provinces had compensation or financial benefits programs for crime victims. The government did not report whether any victims received restitution, sought civil redress, or were awarded compensation through provincial programs in 2023. Wow, it did not report. The government did not have a law or policy protecting all victims from being inappropriately penalized solely for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of being trafficked. Authorities reported making such charging decisions on a case by case basis, considering the severity of the alleged crime as well as possible harm to the provision of victim support, trust between victim and authorities, or efforts to hold traffickers accountable. Justice Canada's updated handbook outlined these considerations in cases where trafficking victims commit unlawful acts in the context of being trafficked. Canada's 2014 Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which criminalized the purchase of commercial sex acts, profiting from sex acts provided by another person, and other related crimes, give immunity from criminal liability to individuals who provided commercial sex acts. This is just part one of what all we got to go over, so there's more we got to go over besides this, so please bear with me. The government increased prevention efforts. PSC continued to lead the government's federal interagency task force to combat trafficking, which oversaw implementation of federal anti-trafficking measures under the strategic framework of the government's national strategy to combat human trafficking 2019 to 2024. The national strategy included 57.22 million Canadian dollars in funding over 5 years. and 10.28 million Canadian dollars annually after 2024. The Human Trafficking Task Force and the Directors General Steering Committee, two of the three national strategy governing bodies, convened to discuss the plan's challenges, successes, effectiveness, and future. The Assistant Deputy Ministers Roundtable, the plan's third governing body, did not convene. The federal, provincial, and territorial trafficking in persons working group also convened to facilitate coordination and intra-governmental collaboration. Although the national strategy called for the establishment of a survivor-led advisory committee, the government did not create it during the reporting year. Wow. The government continued researching system inequalities to inform the design, delivery, and implementation of various initiatives funded under the national strategy. Through the Migrant Worker Support Program, the government provided 16.6 million Canadian dollars to 11 community organizations to help foreign workers to learn and exercise their rights while living and working in Canada. Through this funding, the government supported activities tailored to the needs and experiences of this vulnerable population, including provision of services and information and workers, first language events and services during hours workers were likely to be available. Free transportation or virtual or phone-based options, outreach visits to workers in isolated locations, and legal services. The government permitted temporary foreign workers on valid employer-specific work permits and who experienced abuse or were at risk of abuse in the context of their employment in Canada. To apply for an open work permit, such permits allowed a worker to leave an abusive situation and change employers without losing status to work in Canada. The government reported immigration officials had guidelines for processing potential trafficking victims who sought open work permits. The government provided funding to an NGO to operate a national human trafficking hotline available through telephone and online formats nationwide, 365 days per year in more than 200 languages. Hotline staff maintained a national referral directory to connect victims to more than 1,000 local service providers for emergency, transition, or long-term support services. In 2023, the hotline received thousands of contacts and provided service referrals to at least 296 trafficking victims. The hotline connected some callers to law enforcement, but the government did not report the number of investigations initiated when calls to the hotline. The government continued funding support services for young adults aging out of the child welfare system, a population highly vulnerable to trafficking, through the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. These services included activities to provide access to financial support, education, safe and stable housing, and physical and mental wellness. Ontario's provincial government continued funding 9 youth in transition personnel who offer specialized support for trafficking survivors and at risk persons between 16 and 24 years old who are in or leaving care facilities. Under the national strategy, PCSC invested more than 2.3 million Canadian dollars in 17 different organizations providing trauma-informed, culturally relevant support services for at-risk youth and survivors, compared with 2.4 million Canadian dollars invested in 19 organizations the prior year. So you think one's well and good, and then you go like that. Okay, that was a drop off in support. In January 2024, after several years of research and stakeholder engagement on forced labor and supply chains, The government adopted the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act, which required government agencies and certain businesses to report annually on measures taken to prevent forced labor in supply chains. Reporting requirements included an overview of an agency or business's structure and supply chains, existing policies in relation to forced labor, measures taken to remediate any forced labor infractions, relevant training, and risk assessments. Responsible entities were required to submit their annual reports to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness through a publicly accessible electronic registry. Entities or persons failing to comply face fines up to 250,000 Canadian dollars. In summer 2023, Public Services and Procurement Canada published a report based on research gathered from engaging industry, academia, government, and civil society on ethical procurement and supply chain risks. The report acknowledged challenges to combating forced labor in Canadian supply chains, included information and data gaps and limited resources. It provided recommendations to strengthen the anti trafficking framework by including survivor input and future engagement, passing industry specific guidelines, and sharing information and resources to help companies investigate their supply chains. PSPC reported preparing additional awareness materials to promote ethical procurement best practices for suppliers of at risk goods in 2023. The government continued implementing a 5-year national awareness campaign to educate the public on misperceptions surrounding human trafficking, identifying warning signs, and how to report suspected cases to the appropriate authorities. Using advertisements on social media, search engines, news websites, radio, and cinemas, and through in-person events or television segments. The government refined its methods for targeted outreach to match media consumption patterns of children and young adults, indigenous women, and parents. The government conducted outreach to new immigrants and non English speakers through advertising on websites in Mandarin, Cantonese, Spanish, Arabic, Urdu, Tamil, Vietnamese, and Ukrainian. The RCMP continued online nationwide training on human trafficking to school resource officers and distributed presentations for youth and local communities. The government continued building awareness to prevent trafficking among IDPs in and through cooperation with the government of Ukraine by continuing funding to organizations servicing displaced populations. I'm wondering if I want to go ahead and let me go ahead and start getting to the meat and potatoes about the other support groups, how the support system will work here. See, there's Ontario's Anti Human Trafficking Strategy 2020 to 2025. Learn about our plan to build safer communities by combating human trafficking and child sexual exploitation. There's an introduction. Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes nationwide. In Ontario, the majority of reported cases involve sexual exploitation, which may be referred to as sex trafficking. Young women and girls are particularly at risk, though boys, men, and people who identify as 2, 2SLGB25, I said it's got 2 and then it's got a dollar sign. LGBTQ are also targeted. The average age of a recruitment into sex trafficking is 13 years old. Over 70% of human trafficking victims identified by police are under the age of 25. Approximately two-thirds of police reported human trafficking cases in Canada occur in Ontario. To combat the growing problem of child sexual exploitation in the province, Ontario is investing $307 million from 2020 to 2025 on a new anti-human trafficking strategy. Ontario's plan represents the largest total investment and dedicated in anti-human trafficking supports and services in Canada. They're working together. Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy reflects valuable input from survivors of human trafficking, Indigenous communities and organizations, law enforcement, and frontline service providers. Through implementation, the government will work across jurisdictions and work with community groups and educators, as well as with Indigenous communities and organizations, to ensure the strategy is meaningful and effective. As a cross government action plan, Ontario's anti human trafficking strategy incorporates activities across a range of ministries following Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, Ministry of the Solicitor General, Ministry of the Attorney General, Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, Culture, Industries, Minister of Transportation. Here's Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy. Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy will raise awareness of the issue through training and public awareness campaigns, empowering frontline service providers to prevent human trafficking before it occurs and take action early, supporting survivors through the specialized services, and give law enforcement the tools and resources they need to hold offenders accountable. But not these 5 years that y'all were saying, or the so many months that y'all were saying. Y'all got to make it really stand. 14 months is not long enough for a sex offender when they traffic these people. The strategy takes a proactive approach. The strategy takes a proactive approach with actions across government focused on raising awareness of the issue, protecting victims and intervening early, supporting survivors, holding offenders accountable. The raising awareness of the issue. A range of sectors have identified the need for training on human trafficking to equip frontline service providers with the skills needed to respond to cases of trafficking. Raising general public awareness is also key to helping to prevent trafficking before it occurs. Initiatives include launching a new province-wide marketing campaign targeted to teens as well as to parents of children and youth to raise awareness and ensure that everyone knows where to get help. Developing public education materials to respond to specific sector needs and expanding distribution of existing awareness materials through partnerships across government and sectors. Deliver new multi-sectoral anti-human trafficking training that is culturally responsive and survivor informed, including indigenous specific components. Increasing awareness of available training on how to identify and support survivors of human trafficking of the province's emergency departments and sexual assault domestic violence treatment centers. Continuing to engage at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels to share best practices and ensure that preventing and combating human trafficking is a national priority. protecting victims and intervening early. Early intervention and prevention efforts are crucial to effectively combat human trafficking. Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy prioritizes initiatives targeted to child and youth prevention and intervention, as well as supports for young victims. Initiatives include creating new multidisciplinary police and child protection specialized intervention teams focusing on at-risk and exploited children and youth. Establishing dedicated residences to provide specialized support for missing, at-risk, and exploited children and youth, including those under the age of 16. Expanding the Youth in Tradition Worker Program to provide human trafficking supports to youth in care and leaving the care of children's aid societies, including workers to support specific populations such as Indigenous children and youth. Continuing education and prevention efforts geared to children and youth through Ontario schools, building on the school curriculum. Supporting survivors. Survivors of human trafficking require specialized trauma informed community based supports to help them heal and rebuild their lives and to reduce the risk of re exploitation. Initiatives include increasing community focused anti human trafficking services and supports designed for and by Indigenous people by investing up to $4 million per year in the new funding for the Indigenous Bed Initiatives Fund. Enhancing the Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking License Program to serve more communities and build capacity to address trafficking and support Indigenous survivors. Increasing community-based programs to support survivors and individuals at risk of being trafficked by providing up to $6 million per year in new funding for the Anti-Human Trafficking Community Supports Fund. Enhancing access and supports for victims of human trafficking in the justice sector by expanding the Victim Quick Response Program and the Vulnerable Victims and Family Fund, as well as increasing funding for the Victim Crisis Assistance Ontario program to support delivery of community-based victim services. Increasing funding for Indigenous victim services to provide effective and culturally appropriate supports and services to Indigenous human trafficking victims. Expanding the Victim Witness Assistance Program by adding new court-based victim witness services workers to better meet the needs of human trafficking victims while cases proceed through the criminal justice system to support holding offenders accountable. Expanded the current pilot program, which provides free legal support for persons seeking specialized human trafficking restraining orders. Continuing to convene the Human Trafficking Lived Experience Roundtable to enable direct engagement with and input from survivors of trafficking on Ontario's response to human trafficking. Holding offenders accountable. To keep pace with the increasing volume and complexity of human trafficking cases across the province, Ontario's anti-human trafficking strategy provides a coordinated approach to law enforcement with increased capacity for policing, Crown prosecutors, and intelligence gatherings. Initiatives include enhancing the use of major case management for missing persons and human trafficking investigations by investing in software development to assist in meeting specific needs of human trafficking investigators and analysts. Establish a new intelligence led joint forces investigations team from police agencies across Ontario, including the Ontario Provincial Police, Municipal Police Services, and First Nations Police Services. expanded the capacity of the OPP Child Sexual Exploitation Unit to investigate sexual offenses against children, including cases of child sex trafficking. Increasing the investment of institutional security teams, held intelligence officers, and intelligence analysts within correctional services to better identify and monitor human traffickers within the correctional system and identify victims and support a criminal investigation. Enhancing specialized Crown prosecution capacity to respond to existing and additional human trafficking cases to support their ability to effectively hold offenders accountable through vigorous prosecution of charges laid against members of organized human trafficking networks and other sexual offenses against children. Developing appropriate and consistent policing standards for human trafficking and missing persons investigations as part of the Community Safety and Policing Act of 2019 regulatory framework. So, enhanced supports for children and youth. Ontario's anti human trafficking strategy is specifically designed to protect children and youth, providing enhanced supports to address the critical gap in Ontario's approach to date. New actions in the strategy include targeted efforts to build awareness among children and youth, critical intervention tools to protect at risk youth, as well as dedicated supports victims and survivors of human trafficking, including those under the age of 16. Now, I want to show y'all something. I think this is the thing I want to share. Okay? Here you see the Indigenous Anti Human Trafficking Liaison sharing our knowledge. See which one I got going across the screen right now? Hi there, everybody. Good to see y'all. Sounds almost like a slush fund, don't it? Let me make sure I get the other one out there now, too. Does sound like one. So when we go back over here to this one, it says helplines, top for healing, Indigenous Ontario hotline. There's the hotline for them, as well as 1-855-554-4325. Text, call, live chat, National Human Trafficking toll free hotline 1-888-373-7888. What is human trafficking? Human trafficking is defined as recruiting, transporting, transferring, receiving, holding, concealing, or harboring a person, exercising control, discretion, or influence over the movements of a person to exploit them or to assist in facilitating their exploitation. There's got it in sections 279.01 and 279.00011 of the Canadian Criminal Code. Indigenous anti-human trafficking. Indigenous people make up just over 4% of the Canadian population, yet over 50% of the illegally human trafficked persons are Indigenous. Wow. It's a Niagara chapter. Native woman seeks to educate you to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms. Anyone may be trafficked and not realize it. What we offer is educational and service, capacity building, and social service providers, information engagements with business, organizations, and institutional employees, increased awareness across sectors provincially via information sharing, education to affect systems change at multiple levels. What you can do, book us right now for an information session, identify and report, provide information for safer spaces, educate your organization or institution and your immediate circle. It says right here to book a session now. Indigenous Anti Human Trafficking Liaison 905-871-8770. but I've got it in the drop-down menu at my page also, okay? So when we're going to, this is the program where they have the Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking. And they got different sites. They got, I can't even, I'm not even going to try to say the words. Aqua, I don't see if y'all see it over here to my right. Sorry. Get it over here where y'all can see where I'm talking about. Aquasan, Aqua, Aquasasne, Port Francis, Ottawa, and Toronto. We got places there also. I like this, the center here, sex trafficking. Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking launches new It's Time to Talk resource. After research reveals vast majority of Canadians have never discussed protecting themselves and others from sex trafficking. Conversation is an effective way to combat this prevalent issue. Canadians desperately need and want resources. So on February 20th, 2024, Toronto calendar, uh, Canada, sex trafficking is a Canadian issue and our nation knows it. New research reveals that 74% of Canadians believe that sex trafficking is prevalent in Canada, despite the fact more than 70% admit they have never had a conversation with a friend or family member about protecting themselves against sex trafficking. In fact, only 15% of Canadians feel confident in their knowledge about the issue to start a conversation. Trackers exploit this lack of education and awareness to target unsuspecting youth and ensure their crimes go unnoticed in our communities. To mark National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, that was yesterday, February 22nd, the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking is sharing information to help all Canadians talk the talk and facilitate crucial conversations around sex trafficking, especially with young people. The downloadable resource created in consultation with survivors of sex trafficking is called It's Time to Talk, which stands for Teach Yourself About the Issue. Approach the conversation with care, listen and adapt, and know there's help. It is available on the Canadian Human Trafficking website here, and I will click on that to open the link in new window. Oh, well, it's a PDF here, okay? That's what it is. So if anybody wants this PDF, I'll be glad to show. It's out of here too. Sex trafficking is a complex issue. We created this document. I hate how, it's kind of hard to scroll my page right here when I'm this document because concerned family and friends make up the second largest group of people reaching out to us through the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. So it says right here, teach yourself about sex trafficking. Approach the conversation with care. Listen and adapt. Know there's help available. Y'all see over here to the right? That's what the TOAOK. Our research shows Canadians want and need resources to talk about sex trafficking. 97% of those surveyed feel that Canadians have a duty to help youth protect themselves against sex trafficking. 95% of Canadians feel we need more tools to better understand sex trafficking in Canada. Not 85% of those surveyed would like to help end sex trafficking in Canada, but don't know where to start. The Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking operates the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, a confidential, multilingual service available 24/7. If you suspect that you or someone you know may be being exploited, if you want to access support, or if you want to learn more, call 1-833-900 1010 or reach out via chat at www.canadianhumantraffickinghotline.ca. Close out that screen back. That was helpful there. I love that, seeing the TALK standing for that too. The Center created this resource to address the demand for information they have seen through operating the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. Most calls to the hotline are related to sex trafficking, and concerned family and friends seeking information make up the second largest group of callers. The need for resources is further supported by the research findings. 97% of those surveyed feel that Canadians have a duty to help youth protect themselves against trafficking. 95% of Canadians feel we need more tools to better understand sex trafficking in Canada. We went over this a few seconds ago, but 85% of those surveyed would like to help end sex trafficking in Canada, but don't know where to start. 68% of Canadians are open to having a conversation with a young person about sex trafficking, but either need to understand the subject better or feel it's difficult to find the right words. Sex trafficking is a complex and serious social issue that is not going away on its own, said Julia Dredick, Executive Director of the Center. We understand the topic may seem overwhelming, but the reality is we all need to start talking about it. If we ever hope to end sex trafficking in Canada, that's where we believe this resource can make a tangible difference, which it needs to be discussed everywhere, not just Canada, but we're going over Canada right now. That's talking the talk. It's time to talk addresses some of the most pressing information gaps that survey respondents identified, including understanding how traffickers exploit vulnerabilities to groom victims, more education around what a healthy relationship looks like, empowering young people to set boundaries and understand consent. The research also revealed key barriers to having a conversation about sex trafficking, including lack of information, a limiting understanding of the issue, and not being comfortable talking about sex trafficking and or consent. To address these concerns, it's time to talk. Provides four crucial steps in initiating conversation. Teach yourself about sex trafficking. There are many misperceptions around sex trafficking, and it's important to learn the realities. Sex trafficking can affect anyone. It rarely involves being abducted by a stranger. Instead, it's most often calculated and staged luring, grooming, manipulation, coercion, and exploitation by someone known and trusted by the person being exploited. For me, it's my own parents. Approach the conversation with care. It is essential to create a judgment free space void of distractions for your discussion. While there is no script, the Center provides some conversation starters around key issues such as consent, healthy relationships. So y'all do that. You do at the top of a piece of paper. You can start it by saying consent. Talk about talk about healthy relationships, self worth, setting boundaries, as well as some general conversations, do's and don'ts. Listen and adapt. Be an active listener. You may not have all the answers, but that's okay. Discover the information together. If someone is unwilling to talk to you, ensure they are talking to someone, whether that is another adult, a trusted friend, etc. I would rather, like a kid, come to me, it's my kid. I don't want them to go to an unknown adult that might not be so innocent. And keep the door open for future communication. The center also provides practical tips should you discover someone you know is already being trafficked, starting with telling them that you believe them. Exactly. Leave the room or the door open also for the child to be able to come to you. Don't start yelling and saying, "What are you doing in here? You know I'm busy right now. Oh, I'm trying to cook. Oh, I never had no time and no peace of mind." This kid might have something very important to tell you. Don't shy them away. Teach the child that it's okay to come to you. The Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It is a national service providing support for those who may be being exploited or those who simply want to learn more. Independent of police or government, it operates in more than 200 languages and partners with more than 1,000 service providers across Canada to provide local assistance. It's time to talk about sex trafficking. It says download the complete It's Time to Talk document here. Friends and family play a crucial role in preventing sex trafficking and supporting those who are being exploited. While it may seem like a basic concept, open and frequent conversations can reinforce what constitutes a healthy relationship and may identify red flags before a dangerous situation escalates. Don't be daunted. These conversations are essentially about letting people in your life know that you love them unconditionally and that you are always there to help. I'm going to click on this right quick. Hope it's not going to be the same thing. Let's see. It is. Okay. About the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. The Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking is a national charity dedicated to ending all types of human trafficking in Canada. In 2019, the organization launched the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, a 24/7 multi-lingual service that can be accessed via phone, chat, web form, and email. The center also operates as a national backbone organization working on this issue, working with governments, companies, and service providers to facilitate collaboration, identify best practices, and advance change towards ending trafficking in our country. For more information on the center, which I told y'all, Canadian Center, CENTRE, to end human trafficking.ca. For more information or speak with a representative, it should be down at the bottom of the screen. So let's go on down to, I want to see if anybody said anything. I'm sorry that I'm not responding too well right now. I hope everyone's doing good. So let's get back over here. And it's got about the center, it's got human trafficking. Here's signs of trafficking. Warning signs that someone may be a victim of human trafficking include being controlled by others, driven to and from locations, and escorted at all times, being controlled and watched by others, having someone speak for them in public, not having a passport or other forms of ID in their possession, not having control of their own money or cell phone, may have more than one cell phone in their possession, passport and ID documents confiscated by others, not being familiar with the neighborhood they live or work in, being moved frequently, claimed to be new or just visiting, not being allowed to contact family or friends, lying about age, false ID, providing scripted or rehearsed answers to casual questions, and may be in possession of excess cash outside their financial means and have hotel keys. Mental health or signs of abnormal behavior. Act in a fearful, anxious, submissive, or nervous manner. Excessive concern about displeasing partner employee. Oh man, I can remember being like that. Oh man, y'all know my story. Fearful of law enforcement or immigration services. Avoids eye contact. has another person speak for them, may have visible signs of substance dependency, expressing fear and intimidation, through facial expressions or body language. Use slang terminology that is popular within the sex industry subculture, daddy, pimp, bottom, etc. Physical appearance may be dressed in age inappropriate clothing. May be dressed in clothing inappropriate for the time of year or context. May suddenly have expensive clothing, purses, shoes, nail services. Branding with tattoos of the trafficker's name or symbol. May have bruises or other signs of physical abuse, including malnourished. Lacking in basic medical services or is being denied services by employer. May show signs of being physically restrained, confinement, or torture. Victims may not know they are being victimized because they have a relationship with their trafficker. It could be their boyfriend or friend. Not appear to need assistance because they have a place to live, food to eat, nice clothes, medical care, and even a paying job. Be aware of their rights or may have been intentionally misinformed about their rights so they didn't know they could receive help. Be taught to distrust and fear the government and law enforcement officers because they are afraid they will get arrested or deported if from another country. Plus, they said if you tell or something like that, we're going to do something to your families a lot of times too. Feel alone, isolated, helpless, with nowhere else to turn. Subsequently, they will do as they are told. Fear for their safety or the safety of someone known to them, or as I was just saying, as some traffickers will threaten to harm the victim, their friends and family members if they report their situation to or cooperate with law enforcement, and feel as though they have a debt to pay back for things like gifts, drugs, accommodation, recruitment, fees, etc. Suffer trauma and psychological effects and human trafficking related to sexual exploitation. The victims may be exposed to higher incidences of HIV and sexually transmitted diseases. Well, thank God, as many times as I was, like what happened to me, thank God I never had an STD. Thank you, Lord. Sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Trafficked persons, including minors under the age of 18, are sexually exploited when forced into prostitution or forced to perform sexual acts, including exotic dancing or the production of pornography. Sex trafficking victims are coerced or tricked into forced prostitution. Now, are y'all going to turn your head away or sneer or look hateful at somebody and a young kid that's dressed promiscuously? Or y'all got to start maybe looking at another way, like this person might not could help with being dressed like that. She may be forced into that, right? How do we know? We're so quick to judge, right? Trafficked persons are often lured and groomed by people posing as boyfriends or girlfriends and are forced to hand over most or all of the money associated with these acts. Violence and threats of violence are often used as a means of control to force trafficked persons to perform sexual services. Debt bondage often results from gifts, expensive clothes, and drugs that are supplied to the trafficked person by the trafficker during their recruitment phase. Sex trafficking can affect anyone, girls and boys, women and men, anytime, anywhere. Those who are likely to be at risk include those who are socially or economically disadvantaged, such as some Aboriginal women, youth, and children, migrants and new immigrants, teenage runaways, children who are in protection or are in foster care, as well as girls and women who may be lured to large urban centers or who move or migrate there voluntarily. High school students still living at home can be and are trafficked through control and deception of organized crime groups, gangs, individual pimps, and even peers. So I'm fixing to have to mute my mic. Um, so let me go ahead and mute my mic so that. Good evening. Hoping you're doing well.
You know, as an 18-year-old, I may be able to make $200 for having sex with someone. As a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old, I can probably double that. And I've had numbers, can't even count how many kids tell me that, you know, the demand side asks for younger from them. So they're 13 and they say, you know, hey, if you have a little sister, I can babysit for half an hour, I'll give you $1,000.
The biggest risk of being trafficked in Canada is just being a girl. Any girl, anytime, anywhere.
Most people, even now, think that it's a foreign problem, and they don't realize that it is a Canadian problem, and it's happening here in every backyard, in every community right across this country. I can tell you that we've learned from law enforcement and frontline service providers that if you ventured maybe 1.5 kilometers, maybe 2 kilometers from here, you could find victims in hotel rooms.
I was totally unaware of that human trafficking even existed in Canada or in Toronto. And it just strikes me, it always strikes me as ironic when I stand here on the 29th floor and I know that within a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks max, there are victims sitting in hotels, brand name hotels. And it's just wrong.
We know from law enforcement that there is trafficking and coercion and luring going on in high schools, malls, in large department stores, where there are these predators trolling for kids. We know that there are predators who are coming into our children's bedrooms on their social media. They have access directly to these kids via their electronic devices, and they are luring them as well with promises of a really good life, with promises of gifts, with promises of fun, and with promises of love.
Cybersex trafficking is the live streaming sexual abuse of children that's viewed over the internet. So in a typical situation, what's typically called a customer, I call them a predator, located anywhere in the world, including here in Canada, and we'll talk about that, can wire a payment easily and anonymously, something as small as $20 up to, we've seen up to about $200 Canadian. And they wire that amount of money to the trafficker, and then they, the customer, are able to actually direct a live sex show. And that's the exploitation of Filipino children on the other side of the screen. So we have had cases involving very young children. In general, our children are very young in this casework, but we've had children as young as 2 who have been victims, and in rare cases, even younger. So Canadians, we are part of this demand. In a study by cybertip.ca, if you guys are familiar with them, they are Canada's tip line for reporting online sexual abuse of children. And so one of the things that they found through their research is that Canada ranks in the top 3 for 60 countries for hosting websites with child sexual abuse images, for hosting the images themselves, and also for selling material on child sexual abuse websites. It is not per capita. So our relatively small size is a country that's not per capita. That's just overall. So we rank in the top 3 for each of those areas.
I've talked to many, but then they come from poverty, and they want stuff too. And there's no time to go to school because you got to look after some of your own siblings, your parents. So you have to have fast, big money, right? And they just get stuck in that, and then they end up disappeared. Many of them never to be seen again.
I work at Red River College, and I'm very privileged to be able to sit with our students that come. And what I'm seeing makes my heart very sad. They have definitely identity crisis in our community. I always ask the question, how many of you know anything about your culture? There might be 2 hands go up out of 25 students that have come from the reserves. So the damage that was done, by that residential school and colonization, we are seeing it in our communities now. When I sat on that task force, the trafficking task force, the thing that really hurt my heart so much, because when all the survey that was done at the end of it all, they said the majority of the children are being trafficked are Indigenous here in Canada. So that was a huge blow to my spirit for sure. Because so I say, well, why is that happening? Because you have broken parents, you see. The parents who have that the residue of residential school and colonization that broke the spirit of our people.
There are so many systemic issues that the Indigenous community are facing: systemic discrimination, racism, historical abuse and trauma, lack of access, I think, to education and opportunities, addictions, mental health issues. All of these are compounded issues, one on top of the other, that I think really makes women vulnerable.
The stats are there. I mean, there's no arguing. In Canada, the young women and older women as well who are most subject to human trafficking are in fact Indigenous. And you link that with missing and murdered Aboriginal women, and you can, it's just one big very complicated issue. You cannot compartmentalize this and say, well, these are the people that are being trafficked for the sex trade, and these are the people that are missing, these are the people who are murdered. It's all part of a very ugly and tragic scene right in our own country.
There are the traffickers who are luring and grooming these girls and then forcing them to work in the sex industry or in the labor industry, predominantly in Canada. Those are the two forms of human trafficking. But then there's also the purchasers or the buyers of these young girls and women. So when you look at that area, it's a business and it's a profitable business. We've been told that this is a very high profit, low risk crime.
I never hear any talk about the perpetrators. Why are we not speaking about the perpetrators? I said, I imagine that most of them are men. And my thought is that if there were no perpetrators, we would not be losing children. So why are we not speaking very strongly about the perpetrators?
I've gone into schools and seen presentations for girls in grade 10, 11, and 12, and it's an auditorium full of young women, and I don't see auditoriums full of young men. So we really focus this issue on survivors and victims of trafficking, and there's 50% of that equation which we often don't discuss, and that is who is buying these women and girls and who is selling them. And I think we need to spend more time talking about that. We need to talk to our boys about that.
I think that if the churches can do anything at all, because if I'm not mistaken, I think when I say that men are the leaders of most churches around the world, right? Okay, now that's a good example of what's happening here. So if they were to do anything at all to save the earth and save the children, they should be a big movement. There should be a big movement of voices speaking the truth and saying, brothers, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, stop abusing children. Stop having sex with children. And that's the kind of a voice we need to hear with the men.
So as a grandparent and as a baptized person, as a bishop in our church, you know, why would I be concerned about this? Well, I love my granddaughter. I also made a vow in my baptism that I would respect the dignity of every human being. And so why would the church be involved in that? Why would the church not be involved in it? It's of the essence of one of the commitments that we make in baptism, to respect the dignity of every human being. And human trafficking is an assault on the dignity, on the beauty of people and the image in which God has created them.
As a group, you're stronger than as an individual. And to be able to actually share that with a policymaker who may be part of the congregation or not is very, very important as well. Being heard and having a collective voice is so important.
You can't get anywhere if you're stuck in your guilt. The church will never get anywhere if they get stuck in their guilt. You got to do something.
No human being should ever be bought and sold. It is not only a national crime, it's a national human rights abuse that happens in this country, and it should not happen anywhere in this world.
Yeah, that's very touching, wasn't it? Can y'all hear me okay? Testing. Yeah, that's very touching, wasn't it? We go there too now. Are you a victim? Know the signs. Are you being controlled by threats, force, or deception? Are you being told to keep in constant contact, given one or more cell phones? Receiving expensive gifts, being isolated from your family and friends, earning or making money and not being able to keep it, forced to give your ID to someone else, told to look sexy, hair, nails, and clothes, etc., being denied sleep and food, being forced to have sex for money. If yes, then you may be a victim of human trafficking. There's help. Contact police or emergency services by calling 911. Call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 833-900-1010. The Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline is a confidential, multilingual service operating 24/7 to connect victims and survivors with social services, law enforcement, and emergency services, as well as receive tips from the public. And here's how it happens. Usually a person is recruited, then they are isolated or transported, and ultimately they are forced to provide labor or service. Recruitment. Sex traffickers approach potential victims in a variety of ways, including pretending to be a potential boyfriend or friend, contacting them via social media, such as Facebook, post newspaper or internet ads for jobs and opportunities, or even threatening or kidnapping them. Often false promises will be made to the victims about money, new clothes, work, or education opportunities, financial aid for the family, etc. There are two types of pimps. The Romeo pimp will draw a young person into their lives with promises of love and affection and access to a more glamorous lifestyle. A guerrilla pimp find young victims and use violence and sexual assault as a way to break that individual and flip them into the game. Many traffickers prey on victims who are looking for the promise of a better life, a job opportunity, or a romantic relationship. Transportation isolation. Victims are often but not always moved around by traffickers to isolate them from family and or people they know or areas that are familiar to them. Victims of sex trafficking are moved from hotel to hotel, province to province. Individuals subjected to labor traffic are isolated, sometimes on rural properties with little contact with the outside world. Exploitation. Exploitation is a key element of human trafficking offenses within the Criminal Code of Canada. Exploitation occurs when someone forces another person to provide labor or service by having them fear for their safety or the safety of someone known to them. Traffickers often use violence. They often use intimidation and they often use deception to make victims do as they say. Why does human trafficking happen? The business of human trafficking is often characterized as a low risk, high reward activity because the crime is clandestine and difficult to detect and investigate. This means that there are relatively low prosecution rates worldwide. Unlike the sale of drugs or guns, human beings can be sold over and over for the financial or material benefit of the traffickers, making this crime extremely lucrative. If y'all ever notice that, drug offenses, they get almost life a lot of times, and these people that's human traffickers and stuff, or these teachers and all these other people, 5, 10 years, 20 years, 15, what's that, The kid's never going to get over something like that, right? The modern justice system still rely heavily on witness testimony to prove that the trafficking has occurred. Due to the trauma experienced during the trafficking, many victims many will have gaps in their memories or become overwhelmed or afraid of afraid in court, sorry. Getting a little flustered here, sorry. The United Nations has estimated that this illegal activity generates approximately 32 billion annually for its perpetrators. Recent global modern slavery index puts the number of modern slavery human trafficking victims at 40 million worldwide today. That was 2017. So we know it's going a lot more now, so many years later. Victims don't come forward to the police or organizations for help for a variety of reasons, such as not recognizing that they are a victim of human trafficking. Well, some people don't come forward when they know that some of the police are involved in it, so you're afraid to tell. Also, lack of knowledge of their rights, lack of documentation, cannot reach out for help due to language barriers, fearful of law enforcement, and lack of trust in organizations that provide assistance. Threats made to the victim and towards people they know or the families. Foreign nationals with precarious status may be afraid to report for fear of being deported. Those who are labor trafficked may not want to report it because it will put fellow workers at risk. For additional information, For additional information, please see frequently asked questions on human trafficking at the following link. What you can do: learn the warning signs of human trafficking and make sure those around you know them as well. It may simply take one person to report suspicious behavior to uncover cases of human. Here's what else you can do to help. Learn about trafficking and become aware of the indicators of human trafficking, vulnerabilities in grooming and luring practices used by traffickers. Share this information with your friends on social media and young people in your life. 2. Speak up. Sexual exploitation and forced labor are driven by demand. Become an advocate for women and girls who are exploited in the commercial sex industry and for those who are being enslaved by their employers. Start a dialogue with your kids, co-workers, and neighbors about human trafficking. Challenge it on a local, provincial, and federal level. Find out what your representatives are doing to address human trafficking in Canada or in the United States or wherever you're at too. Choose to support ethical business practices that produce goods and services that are free of slavery and that promote supply chain transparency. Stop it. If you suspect this is happening in your community or to someone you know, call police, Crime Stoppers, or Sexual Assault Line. Here's a list of numbers that call and resources for victims and families. What it's got right here. You can also volunteer your time with a frontline organization assisting survivors of human trafficking. Change it by supporting the Canadian Centre to End Trafficking as we work to restore freedom and dignity to those affected by the crime. Okay, so here, let me go to here frequently asked questions. Where's the trafficking questions right there? That's what it says. Frequently asked questions. This ain't no questions here, right? You suspect someone may be a victim of trafficking. Okay, but that didn't work out too well, did it? So let's go on to what we did the signs, I believe. Yeah, we did that part. So let's go to the next. Here's what we as parents need to know, okay? The best way to protect your family and friends is by learning the signs of trafficking and creating safe spaces to openly discuss potential risk with your kids. Honest, ongoing conversations about these dangers can make a big difference. If your children ever find themselves in an uncomfortable or potentially dangerous situation, make sure they know how to reach a trusted adult for help. Increasingly, traffickers are returning to online message boards, social media, private messaging apps, video games, schools, and other public places to recruit victims. Traffickers even often connect with children online to begin the process of grooming and learn. They look for vulnerabilities or holes in a young person's life and try to fill them. Do they have low self esteem? Traffickers will compliment them and tell them they are attractive. Do they feel unloved and alone? Traffickers will pose as doting romantic partner or friend and make false promises. Traffickers and other predators are using Facebook, Twitter, Ask.fm, Whisper, Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok to have direct access to kids. They're also using our video game systems, people. And when you're live video chat, you need to make sure you go in there with your kids. Make sure to maybe even have adult um, go in there with them and supervise. Parents should insist on knowing the passwords to their kids' electronic devices. Talk with children about how to stay safe while online and what to do if approached online by a stranger. There are also instances of peer to peer recruitment happening in high schools. It's important to have some frank discussions about this issue with all children, regardless of the gender. Traffickers will sometimes use older girls to recruit younger girls by befriending them before turning them over to a trafficker. A couple years ago, over here at the local McDonald's, there were some kids playing in the toy section, and they had a bathroom as well. And I guess the parent was either at in the bathroom or getting an order. They thought it was okay for their children to be playing with these uh, older children, right? They had their back turned, and thank God they turned around when there's adults that were with these two older children were taking these children out of McDonald's. They had their hands and basically trying to kidnap the kids, and that was local here in Pulaski, Tennessee. Parents need to recognize warning signs and talk about the luring tactics these criminals use with these children. Look for these signs that may indicate your child is being trafficked. An odor controlled love interest who showers them with expensive gifts. They frequently visit places unusual for their age group, such as hotels, motels, and clubs. Marked changes in appearance, staying out late at night, sneaking out, hanging out with new friends who are older than them, ignoring childhood friends and family members, drinking or using drugs, skipping school, skipping meals, not showering, or not changing clothes, exhibiting anxious behavior, lack of sleep, depression, ignoring rules and instructions at home or school, lying or unable to recall events in their lives, carrying a fake ID or having more than one cell phone, has expensive or new clothes, shoes, or jewelry of unknown origin, spending more money and possessing expensive gifts from a new friend or boyfriend, talking about a modeling contract or another job waiting in another town or city, becoming more secretive about spending time online or on their cell phone, becoming frightened of being online or on the phone. I want to thank you all for coming. I think it's very important, the rules and all these different things that we have discussed. We need to be sure to be advocate for our kids and for our women and for the men, everybody that is involved that's going through this. There are a lot of adult male survivors out there that's going through a hard time too. We need to be sure to listen to them. and help them through this difficulty with the psychological. Be a friend. Thank you all so much. And thank you so much for you, O Lady O. I want to say God bless y'all, and I hope this has helped some. And I want to thank Canada for bringing awareness, even though we missed the day yesterday. So we're bringing it today. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you. Do something special for yourselves.